They doubted her. They whispered behind her back. The professor tried to humiliate her in front of everyone. But when she picked up the chalk, she did something no one saw coming. Monica Ellison stepped into the lecture hall, her fingers gripping the strap of her backpack a little tighter than usual. The air inside was still, yet heavy, as if the walls carried the weight of years of expectations. She wasn't new to this feeling, walking into spaces where people questioned her before she even had the chance to speak. But today, it felt different. She took her seat near the front, flipping open her notebook. Around her, students chatted in hushed voices. Some exchanged glances. Others scrolled through their phones, waiting for class to begin. The room itself was massive high ceilings, rows of seats stretching toward the back, a large chalkboard dominating the front, the kind of place designed to make students feel small, to remind them that they had to earn their place here. Dr. Richard Henshaw entered. His presence commanded immediate silence. He was a man whose reputation preceded him: brilliant, ruthless. The kind of professor who took pride in breaking students before molding them into something stronger. But not everyone got the chance to be rebuilt. Monica had studied under pressure before. Long nights, intense problem sets, competitions where one wrong move could cost her everything. But this was different. This wasn't just about proving she understood calculus. It was about proving she belonged. Henshaw placed his leather-bound notebook on the desk, scanning the room. His gaze swept past the students in designer sweaters and tailored blazers before landing on Monica. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smirk, but close. "Miss Ellison," he said, stretching out her name just slightly enough to make it feel like an unfamiliar word. "Let's see what you've got. Come up and solve this for us." A quiet rustling spread through the room. It wasn't just the usual movement of students adjusting in their seats. It was something else. Interest, curiosity, maybe even amusement. Monica knew exactly what this was: a test. And not just an academic one. She closed her notebook and rose from her seat, walking to the front with measured steps. She wouldn't rush, wouldn't hesitate. Any sign of nervousness would be seen as confirmation of what they already assumed. Henshaw handed her the chalk, stepping aside. She stared at the equation. It was designed to trip students up, a multivariate function requiring both precision and intuition. Not impossible, but difficult enough to make an example out of whoever attempted it. She heard a whisper behind her. "She's going to mess it up." Another voice, more skeptical than cruel. "Let's see if she even knows where to start." She blocked them out. Numbers had always made sense to her. In a way, people didn't. The problem wasn't about whether she could solve it. It was about whether they were ready for her to. Taking a breath, she lifted the chalk and made her first mark. But she wasn't just going to solve it. She was going to change the way they saw her. The moment Monica's chalk touched the board, the room grew quieter. The occasional shuffle of a paper, the faint tapping of a pen against a desk. All of it faded. Eyes locked onto her. She moved with precision, writing out the first steps without hesitation. The problem wasn't just about getting the right answer. It was about efficiency. A straightforward approach would work, but Monica saw a shorter path, one that skipped unnecessary steps, one that someone who truly understood the material would recognize instantly. Dr. Henshaw stood with his arms crossed, watching her closely. His usual expression of controlled indifference hardened into something more focused. He wasn't just observing. He was waiting for her to slip. Monica reached the midpoint of the solution, paused just long enough to check her work. It wasn't doubt. It was habit. She had learned long ago that people would scrutinize her every move, so she made sure there was nothing to question. The whispers that had started before had stopped. The students who had exchanged smug glances now leaned forward slightly, some adjusting their seats as if they needed a better view. She kept going. The equation was unraveling before her, piece by piece, falling into place exactly as she had predicted. Behind her, someone exhaled sharply. "She's actually doing it." Another voice, lower, almost begrudging. "And she's doing it fast." Dr. Henshaw cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "Make sure you're not skipping important steps, Miss Ellison," he said. His voice even, but edged with something sharper. Monica didn't turn around. "I'm not." A ripple of reaction moved through the class. Not because of what she had said, but how she had said it. Calm, steady, Absolute. She wrote her final equation, boxed the answer, then stepped back, placing the chalk on the ledge below the board. Silence. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Dr. Henshaw stepped forward, his eyes scanning the work in front of him. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he traced the solution with his fingers, checking each transition. The longer he stood there, the clearer it became. He wasn't looking for confirmation. He was searching for a mistake. Monica watched, arms crossed, waiting. Finally, Henshaw let out a short breath. His jaw shifted as he turned back to the class. An unconventional approach, he said, but correct. The words hung in the air, and in them was an admission he hadn't expected to make. Then, from the back of the room, another voice spoke. "That wasn't just correct," Dr. Elaine Parker said, standing up from her seat. That was brilliant. But while one professor acknowledged her, the other wasn't ready to let this moment belong to Monica just yet. Dr. Henshaw's fingers tapped lightly against the podium as he processed what had just happened. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something more rigid. He turned back to the board, glanced over Monica's work again, searching for a flaw, a weakness, anything that would allow him to regain control of the moment. The students sat frozen in their seats, their attention glued to what would happen next. Monica could feel their stares, the weight of their shifting opinions. Some had expected her to stumble, but now they were waiting for Henshaw's next move. Interesting. Dr. Henshaw finally spoke. His voice was measured, but something in his posture had shifted. He wasn't just acknowledging Monica's work. He was recalibrating, trying to decide how to regain control of the room. His grip on the chalk tightened. "Well," he said, tapping the board lightly, "let's take a closer look." Monica exhaled quietly. She already knew what he was doing. When someone like Henshaw lost control of the narrative, they didn't admit defeat. They redirected. He picked up a fresh piece of chalk, underlined part of her solution. "You chose to bypass the traditional method here," he said, cutting directly to the derivative transformation. He turned, tilting his head slightly. "Tell me, Miss Ellison, why did you assume this was the best approach?" It was a subtle trap, disguised as a question. He wasn't doubting her answer. He was questioning her authority to make that decision in the first place. Monica didn't flinch. "Because the traditional method introduces unnecessary steps," she said. "This approach eliminates redundant calculations and reaches the answer faster." A few students shifted in their seats. Some scribbled notes, realizing she had just explained a more efficient way to solve the problem than what they had been taught. Henshaw raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "And what if I told you that cutting steps can sometimes lead to miscalculations?" Monica met his gaze evenly. "It can," she said, but it didn't. A low chuckle escaped from somewhere in the room. The tension cracked just slightly. As students recognized what had just happened, Dr. Henshaw pursed his lips, his grip on the chalk tightening. "Confidence is commendable, Miss Ellison, but let's test it, shall we?" He turned back to the board. With swift movements, he wrote out another equation. This one was even more complex, layered with variables, limits, and exponentials, designed to trip up anyone who dared attempt it without careful planning. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the board. "Let's see if your method holds up here." Monica didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, picked up the chalk, and studied the equation. It was difficult. That much was clear. But difficult wasn't impossible. She started writing. This time she felt the weight of the room differently. Not just expectation, but something else. Interest. Curiosity. The once dismissive glances had changed. Students who had barely acknowledged her before were now leaning forward, their pens hovering over their notebooks, waiting to see how she would approach the problem. She worked through the first set of transformations, moving with the same controlled precision as before. She didn't pause, didn't second guess. The board filled with calculations, each line flowing seamlessly into the next. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Dr. Henshaw remained silent, watching as the problem unfolded before him. Finally, Monica reached the end. She boxed her answer, capped the marker, and stepped back. She turned to face him. "That's the solution." Henshaw stared at the board. His face betrayed nothing, but his silence spoke louder than words. Then, Dr. Parker stood from the back of the room, That, she said, walking toward the front, is nothing short of genius. But while the professors were processing what had just happened, the real shift was happening among the students. The energy in the room had changed. What had started as a quiet test of Monica's abilities had transformed into something else, something undeniable. The students who had barely paid her any attention before now sat up. Their expressions ranged from intrigue to outright astonishment. Some whispered to each other, not in mockery this time, but in genuine curiosity. "Did you see that?" one murmured. "She skipped 3 steps and still got it right." Another replied. Monica could hear them, but she didn't react. She simply returned to her seat, calm, composed, as if she hadn't just flipped the entire room's perception of her on its head. Dr. Parker, now standing near the board, crossed her arms and studied the work. "Not only is it correct," she said, "but she found an optimization most students wouldn't even consider." She turned slightly, her gaze shifting to Dr. Henshaw. "You should be impressed." Henshaw's jaw tightened. For just a second, so quick that most wouldn't have noticed. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he stepped forward. "It's certainly a different approach," he said, reaching for the chalk. "But let's examine." Dr. Parker cut him off. "No need." Her tone was light, but firm. "I've already checked it. It's flawless." For the first time, Henshaw hesitated. He had built his career on being the final authority in his classroom, the one who dictated what was right, what was acceptable, what was worthy of recognition. And yet, here was a first-year student, one he had clearly underestimated, challenging that unspoken order without ever saying a word. Monica kept her eyes forward, waiting for what would come next. A few seats over, a student who had previously laughed at her now raised his hand. "Professor," he asked, hesitating slightly, "can Monica explain how she saw that shortcut? I wouldn't have even thought to approach it that way." Monica blinked, momentarily surprised. She had expected resistance, maybe even more dismissal. But this was different. Dr. Parker nodded. "That's an excellent idea." She turned to Monica. "Would you mind walking them through your reasoning?" For the first time that day, Monica hesitated, not because she was unsure of herself, but because she had never been asked to explain her thought process in a way that wasn't a test. She glanced at the board, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I looked at the structure of the equation first," she said, her voice steady but measured. "Instead of working through the standard steps, I recognized a pattern in the coefficients that allowed me to factor out certain terms early. That simplified the problem before I even started solving." A few students nodded, some scribbling notes, others staring at the board as if seeing it differently for the first time. "That's why you skipped the second step," one of them muttered, mostly to himself. It wasn't a guess, it was intentional. Dr. Parker smiled slightly. "Exactly." Henshaw remained quiet, watching the room shift around him. The students, who once followed his lead, taking his judgments at face value, were now looking at Monica in a way they hadn't before. Respect. It wasn't instant. It wasn't unanimous. But it was there, creeping in, breaking through the assumptions that had lingered when she first walked in. Monica didn't need their validation. She had never sought it. But seeing the doubt in their eyes turn into something else, that was its own kind of victory. But the real moment of reckoning wasn't with the students. It was what Dr. Henshaw would do next. Dr. Henshaw stood stiffly at the front of the room, his usual air of control slipping through his fingers. The class wasn't waiting for him anymore. Their attention had shifted, not to him, to her, to Monica, to her work, to the realization that she wasn't just capable, she was exceptional, and he could feel it, the subtle change in the air. The students who once hung onto his every word were now looking at him differently, waiting to see how he would respond. His grip on the chalk tightened. "Well," he finally said, his voice carefully neutral, "it seems Miss Ellison has a unique way of approaching the material." Unique. A word that danced dangerously close to dismissal. Dr. Parker caught it immediately. "I'd call it advanced," she countered, tilting her head slightly. "She didn't just solve the problem. She optimized it. That's not just talent, that's mastery." Henshaw's lips pressed into a thin line. He was cornered, and he knew it. His usual tactics wouldn't work here. Not after Monica had proven herself so decisively. Not with Parker reinforcing it. So he did what men like him did best. He adjusted his tie, forced a thin smile, and nodded. Yes, well, I suppose we'll see how she performs on the next exam. A classic move. He wasn't conceding. He was deflecting, trying to shift the moment from Monica's success to future scrutiny. But Monica didn't flinch. She understood exactly what he meant. This wasn't over, but it didn't have to be. She had made her point, and so had the room. As the class gathered their things, the murmurs returned. But they were different now. Students who had ignored her before now glanced at her with curiosity. Some with admiration, others with quiet uncertainty, as if they were recalibrating their assumptions in real time. One of them, a guy who had openly doubted her earlier, hesitated as she packed her bag. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. That was impressive. Monica didn't pause. "I know." He blinked, then let out a small laugh. "All right then." She slung her backpack over her shoulder, walking toward the exit, her steps steady. She had spent years proving herself in spaces that weren't made for her. This was nothing new, but today something had shifted, not just in the room, not just in the way people saw her, in the way she saw herself. She had known her worth before. Now, they did too, because respect isn't given, it's earned, and she had just earned it. Monica stepped out of the lecture hall. The door clicked shut behind her. The cool afternoon air hit her skin, a sharp contrast to the tension that had filled the room just moments ago. She took a deep breath, letting the weight of the past hour settle. She had done it. Not just solved the problem, not just stood her ground against Dr. Henshaw. She had changed something. She pulled out her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through her messages as she made her way across campus. A notification popped up. "Jordan, how was class?" Monica smirked, thumbs flying over the screen. "Monica, same as usual, except I just made Henshaw eat his own words." The typing bubble popped up almost immediately. "Jordan, no way. What happened?" Monica considered how to summarize it in a single message, then typed, "Monica, let's just say he thought he could embarrass me. He ended up embarrassing himself." Jordan's reply came in seconds. "Jordan, that man has been a problem for years. About time someone put him in his place." Monica exhaled a short laugh. She wasn't naive. One class, one moment, wouldn't change everything. Henshaw wasn't going to suddenly respect her. Some students would still see her as an outsider. But this wasn't about them. It was about every student who would come after her. The ones who would sit in that same room, face the same challenges, feel the same weight of expectation pressing down on them. She had cracked something open today, forced people to see her not as an anomaly, not as an exception, but as exactly what she was. Brilliant, unapologetic, unshaken. And that mattered. She slipped her phone into her pocket, her steps lighter than they had been that morning, because respect wasn't something you waited for. It was something you demanded, and she would demand it every single time. If you've ever felt underestimated, let this be your reminder. Your talent speaks for itself. You don't need permission to be great. Keep pushing. Keep proving them wrong. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. If you've ever been underestimated, your talent speaks louder than their doubts. You don't need permission, thy courage to prove it. What's a moment in your life where you proved someone wrong? Drop your story in the comments below. The lesson, it's earned. And sometimes is to let your success speak for itself. Tag a friend, like if you've ever had to fight for your place. Subscribe for Prove Them Wrong, earn your respect.